Hey everybody, so welcome. I am Matt Segal. I am a senior product marketing manager here at Liongard, and I have with me today Matt Lee, Andy Anderson, and Vin Tran, all to talk about cybersecurity and risks to look out for in 2023. Would you all do a quick round of introductions? Matt, starting off with you.
Yeah, Matt Lee, formerly bearded Cyber Matt Lee, now more bearded Cyber Matt Lee. No, I tease. I was with an MSP. We grew that from $1 million in revenue to undisclosed number and sold for 14 times EBITDA in November 2 years ago. So had a fantastic run there and decided to take that learning and try to apply it to educating other MSPs and channel members around cybersecurity. So that's what I do almost every day of my life. Thanks for having me here. I'm excited.
Fantastic. Andy, you're up next.
Yeah, Andy Anderson, CEO of DataStream Insurance. We work hand in hand with hundreds of MSPs essentially to help their clients address cyber risk and get good cyber insurance for them. And so I've been working for 10 plus years at the intersection of cybersecurity and insurance, trying to understand, again, kind of this wild and crazy world through two pretty complex ecosystems. So having a lot of fun and great to work with kind of hundreds of MSPs on a weekly basis. It's fun.
All right, and you got Vin Tran wrapping it up.
Yeah, so I'm Vin Tran. I've never been able to grow a beard, so I'm so jealous.
I mean, it's like, sad and patchy when I try. Right?
I'm the COO and co-founder of Liongard, and we're here to help provide MSPs with all the visibility they need in our deep data platform that basically makes sense of all the systems that they manage using automation and helping them solve complex problems like cybersecurity and just plain and simple, sleep at night and keep their sanity. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Well, I'm excited to have all of your different perspectives on these. And without any further ado, we can go ahead and get started here. So our first item on the list, basic security, hygiene, and doing it well. Top things to look out for in 2023 for cyber risks. Turns out you just can't forget the basics, huh?
Do you just try to pull my chain like this first out of the gate? Is that what we're doing, Matt? Like we're just running it out? Yeah. I mean, I had this conversation with Phyllis Lee. So if you don't know Phyllis, she's the senior director of controls. Now she's in charge of all content for the controls family for CIS. And this conversation, what's that?
That was a great episode, by the way.
Thank you so much, man. We had a great conversation. But she said, every time we find these giant sophisticated hacks, it's always some basic hygienic thing. It's always something basic. It's always just that repeatability not being done, right? And I always bring this back to that same analogy of, it's like locking the door on the house, but not checking to see if that actually locks the door, right? It's basic things of just doing those basics really well and ensuring they actually function. My alarm does go off whenever the door is open, those type of things. So all the other stuff we're going to talk about today, all the attack surface, all the things that come out of that, it really genuinely comes down to, if you're not answering the basics, if you're not doing those very basic things, I'm probably going to beat you with the basics.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think, we see the same thing, right? And whenever we see claims or talk with incident responders, right? It's sort of like, again, the same patterns over and over again. But I think that one of the things that we have to appreciate is just how many basic things there are to do when you start looking at, even small organizations, like the number of systems, the upgrades, the number of different tools that they're running, et cetera. So that's a challenge, right? But I think there's always this tension that particularly technical people have between sort of comprehensive and complicated, right? And comprehensive is, kind of not just the basics, but doing the basics across multiple disciplines, right? We often talk of kind of this three-legged stool approach to cyber risk, which is, the technical aspects of it, the sort of compliance aspects of it, and the cyber insurance aspects of it. And if you have like kind of all three in place, and again, take half an hour, a year to make sure that the basics are in place, and you're not going to have those business ending type experiences as often. Right?
Yeah. If you go through and read through the Verizon data breach investigations report, I mean, at the very end, the very last page, it literally lists out the best practices from CIS, which it's like
right,
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and awareness training, 14. go through those. I mean, and implementation group one, just start there and make sure that your partners and your end customers understand what you're doing for them there. And yeah, that is the list. There is a formula to get to that.
Right. Yeah. And I think just calling out that extra point, Vin, because you hit the nail on the head. We're so used to, as an industry, as MSPs, to shooting from the hip, right? To just doing what's next necessary to make efficient and functional computer systems, that we've really not had this formula, if you will, for following how do I secure somebody.
Yeah.
And you start looking at what CIS is putting out and different NIST, CSF, all the different frameworks. They point towards that map, right? And to what you just said of that IG1 and going through the basics, right? That's the basics. That's the hygiene. Having a good plan of what systems are touching my stuff, how many people, what software are we using, where's my data? Like, yeah, basics. So great call out.
Yeah.
And that really segues well into our second topic here. So coming up next, other risk here, not relying on process and automations and instead relying too much on humans and human error. Vin, I feel like you might have some thoughts on this one to kick us off.
Yeah. So, I mean, go back to what CIS, if you read the first few rules or the controls, it says establish and maintain, right? We're great at establishing. MSPs are really good at like starting stuff, man. But like in terms of maintenance, that process, you can have an intern start or level 1 engineer. You can have, you know, some automation scripts written. That maintain part, that manage part, that takes some endurance. That's a marathon. It's kind of like, so Andy's point, it's all about the automation that you put behind that in order to then provide that insight on a consistent basis so that you don't run into fatigue. I mean, we run our own cybersecurity shop here in-house, and it's just a constant, you know, wheel that you're on. And yeah, you kind of have to work smarter. I mean, it's, sorry, cliche, but that you get to that point where you know what you have to look for, and you set the right alarms and you've set the right alerts in place so that you can do more with less.
Here's what's interesting that I'll add to this, and is that if you look at automation, you're trying to remove the stupid human. Like, you're ultimately trying to remove my normalcy for failure, which is just part of being human. We fail. But when you think about that, in the past, if you were dealing with a company that was running, they either had server 2003, 8, 8R212, 12R216, 1920. They had different forest function levels. They had different virtual machine infrastructure. They had different needs. They had different design. But if you start a company tomorrow, if I started a company tomorrow, if it was, let's call it Schmax 8, let's say, right? I wouldn't have servers. I wouldn't have line of business infrastructure. I would absolutely use an identity-centric piece and then extend that into one of X number of SaaS applications. If you take that pure vision of what Vin was just talking about, and now saying, I need to manage all of this and I need to maintain it, I can maintain it monolithically for every customer in that type of play. Right? If I'm just handing off an IDP or an identity provider layer to someone, and I'm managing the best practices of token management and the best practices of how their machines are set up and how we do these things, not only can I maintain that across all my client base at almost unlimited scale, but I also can find those alerts to hunt for in Liongard to say, this is a problem, this is out of configuration. Why? Because the configuration is monolithically similar. And so I would say one of the interesting parts about this rely on process automation is, when you get to a more and more unified stack, everybody's just Graph API, some type of GUID, some type of secret, the same type of infrastructure. I can manage that the same for everybody in a very, very efficient way. So I would absolutely say that this is the next biggest gain, so that you can focus resources on maintenance. So you can focus resources on maintaining at scale some monolithic security approach to a lot of things. Summarizing quite a bit, but
yeah, I think you know, just to chime in here, right? So I was a pretty serious athlete for a while, you know, kind of I rode through college and a number of years afterwards, right? And I equate kind of like maintaining security as kind of like staying in shape, right? And I before COVID, I would go to the gym every, you know, almost every day. They had childcare there too, which made it particularly easy. Like I could get, you know, not have to watch my kid for an hour or two.
winning.
January is always like, oh my God, like everybody's showing up. Everybody's going to be here for like, you know, the next 3 weeks. And then slowly they're all just going to disappear. Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of like what setting a good security program is like. Everyone's like so excited. We're going to put all this stuff in place. And then they just lose motivation and they sort of like, okay. And so again, you know, how do you set up this sort of symbiotic system where it's a mix of human who are setting up, perhaps tweaking and adjusting with a series of automations and machines that don't get tired and don't get demotivated and just consistently do what you tell them to do. 365 days a year, 24/7, right? And if you start
quick question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go.
Had a quick question for you, just in terms of the insurance perspective on automation, looking at that as you're evaluating how you might set up a program for somebody, their deductible, their general payments. Does automation play a role in that at all as you're evaluating, and trying to like help people get those connections?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're seeing out of the insurance ecosystem is kind of an appreciation for the differences between organizations, right? And I think the risk modeling, the underwriting is maturing, right? I don't think you yet have seen quite the underwriting community to start understanding that. You've not been looking for particularly questions and criteria around automation, although you do sneakily you're starting to see questions that are nodding to it, like what is your patch cadence and what is your speed to remediate like these problematic pieces, right? And it is wild when you do see like where the claims are taking place, how long some of those vulnerabilities are still being exploited, right? So like, again, we would love to say like 24/7, 365 things are happening and like, and addressed, but gosh, this regularity could be monthly. Gosh, I'd like to see even say quarterly that you checked for all, critical vulnerabilities and were addressed. And if you did that, you would probably be better than 90% plus of the folks that are getting attacked. It's sadly, we're still, a lot of low hanging fruit are getting exploited for sure.
And that gets right back to our first one, basic security hygiene. Like you got to pick those low hanging fruits and get them off there, because you can have all of the high functioning things you want, and it doesn't matter if, somebody's just going to click a link on an email.
Well, and let's be true about this. The automation's happening on the other side. Right. When I'm doing my digging into what vulnerabilities exist, right? And Vin, this, I'm able to just script it and wait until Shodan has the right dump for me and I attack that. That's not hard. Yes.
Yeah. It was one of the original premises when we were coming up with Liongard, was enabling the folks that are the operational side, managing the configuration, moving them left of boom, right? I mean, we have so many logging tools and antivirus and anti-malware right at the point of the incident, but it's just like, how do you get ahead? How do you know beforehand, right?
Exactly.
You have to do the same thing the hackers are doing, and you have to recon your own environments and your customers' environments and do those. But I also wanted to say, like, there's the tools in terms of the basic blocking and tackling. You have the tools, but a good chunk of the work is the process. And Andy, you're like saying it's just a monthly process or whatever, and getting the folks in the right place. Because like sometimes the security team and the MSP, when you look at it, if you look at cybersecurity as a whole, a lot of times it's kind of this highfalutin word, and people are like, okay, well, it's basically barriers, right? And it's a lot of these technical things, technical tools, alerts that are going off all the time. But at the end of the day, it's truly about safety, right? And it's like the security team is going around and putting in like child safety locks and little padded corners and protecting our teammates and making sure that they're doing the things they do, and then being able to teach them to say, okay, well, hey, be aware of all these things that might be knocking on the door, using the tools and reacting to the alerts instead of just necessarily relying on them to prevent everything.
And, just to sort of complicate everything here, we're going to move on to our next one and introduce a fun little paradox from everything we've been saying, which is also focusing too much on technical tools and not enough on relationships. You can get the newest tool, you can get the next greatest thing, but ultimately, if you don't have people believing you that what you're trying to do is important, to change behaviors, to invest with you in changing behaviors, you're really setting yourself up for failure. So I wanted to hear all of your thoughts on that one. Andy, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I think everyone, a lot of the people who work in this space, we're all sort of fascinated by technology. And so it's not surprising that we're sort of always looking for like the newest, coolest, shiniest object, right? I certainly have that problem, right?
I'm a
And so,
nerd.
again, yeah, and you sort of forget, okay, like the regularity of one, getting everybody else like herded and moving in the same direction, that takes a lot more energy and a lot more effort than like just chasing after this next, and getting this new cool toy that we can play with, right? But I think, yeah, thinking about ultimately the people can be exploited, right? And that's often the weakest link. I think I think sometimes we blame people too much, right? It's sort of like, and ultimately, yeah, there is usually a human somewhere in the causal chain. But to expect perfection from humans is to continuously disappoint ourselves. And so what we should actually be thinking about is a defense in depth and a system that is not necessarily quote unquote secure, but resilient, right? And the real difference between those two is really that, if you're building a resilient system, it's one that can fail but recover quickly, as opposed to one that has a very, very low failure rate. And I think one of the things that I talk a lot with people is to think about, not thinking about stopping all of these, but to think about how you would recover. And also when you're designing those systems, thinking about the worst case scenarios, and trying to make them very unlikely, and usually doing that through particularly redundancy and independence of systems, right? So, and that's
Matt, is this
not
something that you've also seen?
Go ahead.
I'd focus
sorry,
on it from a
Interrupt
I'd
you there,
focus on it
sorry.
from a little bit different perspective, in the sense that focusing on tools too much and not enough on relationships also comes in subject matter expertise and capabilities too. In the sense that, oh, I bought a brand new awesome antivirus, right? I'll tell you this story. And you know what's neat? My antivirus stopped 5 threats in about 4 minutes on this same machine. And then I never heard from it again. And I think the challenge is that we often think that a threat stopped means that we're done, instead of it being, maybe sometimes I need the threat expertise to realize that's Matt Lee hammering on the keyboard. And because the first 4 failed to get under that EDR, he used the 4th one that allowed him, or the 5th one that allowed him to get underneath that EDR. And so when I bring that back to, from an analogy of, we need to make sure we have those relationships. If you aren't able to field a SOC and manage that and deal with it yourself and have the expertise, you partner. And if you partner, you bring the right data sets, you ensure that they understand your mission, you tie in operationally. And that all goes back to relationships, right? That all goes back to picking service providers, working with them, partnering with them. If you're going to deal with DataStream and say, hey, DataStream, help me out with all my insurance on my partners, that's going to be a two-way street of relationships, right, that exist in this. And I think that's one of the challenges that I face, is that we have too many things where we think we are the smartest guy or gal in the room. And the more and more I can decide that I'm not, and that I need to include other SMEs and other partners and grow my knowledge, the better and better I'm going to get at this. So I agree wholeheartedly with this third point.
Vin, is this something you've also run into?
Yeah, I think kind of to what Matt's point is around understanding and teaching also the risk. I mean, the other side of security is risk, right? And you're trying to balance out this, and having your entire team understand how to quantify it and recognize it, and making sure that your ecosystem is also working together to help reduce and mitigate that. It is about, on a separate note, the ecosystem, the relationships within all the vendors, within the MSPs, we kind of have to work together, because like if you think about it, safety or security is not necessarily one person. You have to work together. You can't compete on it, right? It requires the sharing of data. And again, it's one of the reasons why Liongard is kind of agnostic around this, and being able to bring all that information as much as possible so that you can do something with it and not necessarily just keep it siloed away.
So moving on to a slightly more, let's say, technical focus thing, I want to talk about, what happens when somebody really puts you in their sights, right? You have a threat actor who's decided, I'm going to go after you. And they have some pretty wild tools at their disposal, but particularly spear phishing is one that I've heard come up a lot because it's that really scary mix of highly skilled technical tools and also advanced social engineering that get around a lot of the things that we normally teach people when it comes to avoiding that. So I guess, Matt, is that something that's on your radar as well?
Yeah, and it blows my mind. There's a package out there called EvilGenix 2. And it was predecessed by EvilGenix 1, but it's a platform for AITM, or adversary in the middle attacks, where I can spear phish you, have you connect and sign into Microsoft regardless of your MFA. I mean, obviously, other than FIDO tokens, and then steal your identity. And the interesting part about that, and this is where I'll tie this right back to kind of the earlier question of automation and having the kind of platforms to identify these things, is there's a simple fix for it. Right? You can have a conditional access policy for the more sensitive things that say, hey, don't make my token lifetime 90 days anymore. Let's make this 2 days. Now my initial access broker can only sell that account that I've stolen for X period of time before it expires, right? Secondarily, you have the capability to set it up to say, hey, if I have an event or a security event where an AITM has happened, I want to know about it and I want to deal with it. I want to shut off the account. I want to do those things. Those are the type of things that you could surface in a data platform like that and see. But yeah, spear phishing is the go-to, right? Because you're seeing criminals and threat actors shift from writing custom awesome malware to, for the most part, just using living off the land tools or Lotl, where I'm just going to take over Vin's identity, hopefully, and see if he has the right access structure to the data I want, and then just steal it. No malware included. I did nothing but get his identity and get in and get access. And so spear phishing obviously has payloads and things, but they're not always malware. They're sometimes identity centric. So still one of the best things. It is probably my go-to of how I would attack someone. There's tons of data out there. I can go and find out if Vin's a cyclist or a whatever it may be, and cater that towards that attack surface, right? So spear phishing is still probably going to be the most effective delivery method in multiple different fashions. Some of the things I'd watch out for is team spear phishing. You're starting to get into where I could compromise a secondary identity somewhere just to ask and compromise you up the chain, right? From a trusted source. Oh, I already talk to Matt in Teams all the time. Why is he asking me to do this in Teams? We really haven't even seen that surface area fully explored, but spear phishing is still probably the most effective tool in my arsenal for sure.
Yeah.
Andy, Vin, do you have any thoughts on this one?
It's going to continue to proliferate. I mean, the thing is, once we share so much data out there, there's so much information about us, and that it is just an enormous amount of surface to recon. So it's extortion, ransomware, all this stuff. It's one of the oldest things in the book. So right, it's got to continue to happen. So
Yeah,
as long as there's money and there's data to be made from that data, I think spear phishing is going to continue to proliferate.
Yeah, I mean, I not from the technical side, but I think, thinking about what are the truly kind of crown jewels of an organization, right? And figuring out how do you maybe take them off an easy pathway to get to, like you don't, if they aren't changing, right? Or, how do you, or they're not changing rapidly in a significant way, how do you truly take them off kind of an area, assuming that you were, having a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of day, right? Like almost imagine that a super administrator was truly evil, right? How would you then assure that you could survive that? Almost thinking like insider threat kind of gaming, I think would be really interesting. And again, if you start flipping your mind to the place of like, I'm not trying to stop this, but I'm trying to survive this, right? You actually put yourself in a place that you can start to really relatively inexpensively and quite quickly take those true disaster type scenarios off the table, right?
Yep.
The reason that almost always people are paying ransomware is they don't have really good backup. And so they then, they're like, I'm done here, right? I've got to pay for this. And then the next is like, okay, you have some super sensitive data that I don't want to get leaked out there. Do you really access that super sensitive data on like a daily or regular basis? Like go look for it now, put it somewhere where it's not like, it's not as easily accessible, et cetera.
Right.
So.
Yeah, it's funny. Did you have the list before this? Because that is exactly our next topic. In terms of mitigating these risks, because it's all about risk mitigation. It's all about these low probability, high impact risks where it's not very likely to happen. it's hard to conceptualize, but when you roll the die thousands of times a day, it starts to become a lot more probable. So what do you do, number 5, with your risk of inadequate backups? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Andy.
I mean, like, there's a lot of good providers out there. I think, fundamentally, I just don't think the number of organizations that have actually done a business impact assessment, right? And again, that's not a like super complicated exercise. It's literally like, what is going to kill me? What is the most precious? And then how do I how do I take those truly terrible events off? And again, like, there's some great solutions there, but like literally for most organizations, they could buy like 10 thumb drives a year, plug them in, once a month, save truly the like crown jewels to that thumb drive, throw it in a desk, mark the month and the year, and then just, again, assuming you trust that person, because again, they could be, there are other issues there, right? Like encrypt it or put a password on it or whatever, right? So somebody doesn't get to your drawer of a dozen backups. But yeah, like that sort of stuff is again, little stuff could really save you, right?
Yeah, having it all properly done turns a huge event into a non-issue.
Totally.
Yeah, and you nailed it on that backup. BIAs, or business impact analysis, of just literally walking through what systems depend on what, and what things do I have, and what's my time it can be down, ensures you have an adequate backup. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, you're looking at a restore point objective and a restore time objective. Where do I need to restore to? What data can I lose? And how long is it going to take me, and how long can I have it down, right? You're speaking towards those points, and you can be strategic to Andy's earlier point of saying, I used to have this term, I would call it live compromised. And it was this theory that at any point, anybody has an ephemeral level of trust. I could become a bad person if I'm compromised, or if I'm so chosen or coerced to do so. So how do you limit the damage? How do you limit how much impact there is? Well, it's two things. It's making sure that you limit what they have access to only the important things, back to your, Andy moving the crown jewels somewhere else if they're not necessary today. And also having a great backup so that you can prove the CIA triad, or confidentiality, integrity, and availability, have not been violated, right? And that's the whole point of that. So yeah, beat the backup thing to death, but I wanted to make sure I had that.
I mean, maybe before we go to Vin, I would say one other, not to just think about the data, but to think about your systems, right?
How they interoperate. Yeah, how they connect. What's dependent on what?
And where is their redundancy and independence, right? So last week we were talking kind of as we kicked this off, Office 365 was down for email for several hours, right? And that's like a critical system for us. I mean, still most of our stuff, we converse with people via email. We actually have 2 email systems in place. We also use Google workspaces as well. And we've had that forever, right? And again, having a backup of a system that you can immediately default over to in this sort of cloud world, setting that up is incredibly inexpensive. And if you actually have access to your systems that are working now, moving over that, again, it's probably not going to operate quite as well, but that being able to kind of like not be dead in the water is massive in terms of like,
and that's a term of COOP, right? That's continuity of operations planning, right? Is what that comes into, is continuing to function. Sorry, go ahead, Vin. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah.
No. I was just commenting. Yeah, the cloud backup, making sure that you have redundant systems, so for you have continuous business continuity. I mean, that is the game, right? And making sure that the backups exist. Hopefully, it's not due to an event like ransomware, but it could just be mistakes, because they happen. Just accidentally deleting things. But like we're getting into making sure that the people have what they need, how they access the information. We work from everywhere. I mean, the original premise of kind of thought of this discussion is like, in the past 2 years, we've gone from working inside our offices to everywhere, and making sure that everyone's network is secure from home and wherever they are, and dialing back into the main systems, and you don't know what's going to happen. So like zero trust is the thing now. Zero trust is something that we've been trying to roll out for the last few years, starting with things like secure access service edges or something like that, so that you can create those VPNs, so you can create safe access to the data that you have. and that data itself should be backed up and ensured securely. So,
yeah. So I guess moving on here, again, talking about some of these more basic security hygienes, like one of the joys of being an MSP and managing things at scale with people is having a lot of devices, and particularly firewalls, and the unbelievable amount of time suck that can represent. So love for you all to, talk about some of the dangers and risks of those misconfigured firewalls, especially as we go more into 2023 with a greater prevalence of threat actors kind of knocking at the door, seeing how they can get in. And is that something you mind starting us off on?
I don't. I mean, the thing is, it's one of the initial things, and when we were writing inspectors for Liongard, is like the misconfiguration of firewalls is something that, well, it has to start with the manufacturer shipping it, us keeping the default passwords in, having untrained folks configure it, or not double checking it or making sure that it's in place. So that was one of our biggest concerns, and originally it was the definition of the perimeter, right? The firewall was the hard candy shell that if you didn't have that done right, well, you might as well just, go home. So it's just like, so it's still there, but the firewall it works for the centralized networks, but now we're so in a disparate working conditions these days or distributed working conditions that it's important to protect you kind of the home data center, but in terms of the overall perimeter and the surface area that we're dealing with these days, it's probably more, I don't know, it should be done correctly. But things like SASEs, the secure edges will help us make sure that at least the data flows and the folks that are accessing it are doing it correctly. Those are the things that we need to start moving into.
Yeah.
My only piece to add on that before we move on to the next topic from a firewall perspective is, yes, I agree that walled garden mentality worked great for castles until cannons were invented.
Yeah.
Right. And then castles didn't exist anymore. And so it's the same premise here with us in this, that we're moving from this walled garden of firewalls. That said, though, you're seeing MSPs shift from point solutions and firewalls everywhere to more cloud managed firewalls, things that they can do API wise and manage the configuration monolithically. And, you're seeing that become more and more the norm across the board for managing that scalability. But we can move on to the next topic, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, Andy, was there anything you wanted to add there before we move on?
No, I think you guys covered it.
Yes. Well, in terms of moving on from our walled gardens to another better structure, Matt, I know this is something you've spoken about at length. What about zero trust frameworks in ZTNA?
Yeah. Well, I'm no John Kindervag. I am writing the ZTNA test material for CSA around SDP and SASE type methodologies. But the point that Vin made earlier is that, Phyllis Lee says your network ends where your user's fingertips land. Right. And that conversation is saying that we're doing exactly like Vin said, we're working from Starbucks or my house or wherever, where it might be real convenient to put a Plex server on my machine. And then, oh, wait, now I have a giant, never mind, maybe that's too soon. Vin knows what I'm talking about. But the point is, right, you live in that world, and ZTNA is this simple premise. When you're talking about cybersecurity, you have two defined surfaces. You have an attack surface and a protect surface. A protect surface is something you own. Everything you own is your protect surface. It literally everything has a protect surface. But attack surface is what you choose to expose to an enemy, right? And what you allow it to be accessed from an enemy. And so when you start thinking about that network I talked to you about before, now we're using SaaS and we're using identity centrism, and we're using ZTNA is now saying, before you can even sign into that, trust is ephemeral. And I'm going to give you only access to see what you should see after a single packet authorization, right? Without getting too nerdy, we're now saying, oh, I know that's Vin. He's coming from the right type of machine. Let's pass him on and now actually authenticate him. And now, only now, can we show him that attack surface, which means that attack surface isn't viewable until after the zero trust has been mitigated from that respect. So I think the lack of ZTNA and lack of zero trust frameworks will become more and more apparent as more and more disparateness, as been stated, continues to be driven by COVID and the pandemic and the change in our world. So ZTNA is going to be a big thing. But again, all the way back to Andy's point and back to Vin's earlier point, it's a continued thing. It's going to continue to change. It's going to have to shift. The protect surface and attack surface will shift in their percentages as time goes. And you have to be able to moderately shift back and move around. And A lot of the things we're talking about in the efficiency and automations are how you would do that efficiently at scale.
Yeah. And I think if
Is
I
there
were to
anything
add,
that you'd like to put on there?
yeah,
Yep, go ahead.
I mean, I obviously been swimming around this ecosystem for a while, and I think my view is, we've all loved the zero trust architecture for a while. Like it, at an academic level, it just sort of makes sense. I think until it really gets married closely with sort of the CASBs, the cloud access security broker frameworks, and where it's not only more secure, but it's also easier for the user, right? Like that's when you're going to see sort of wide adoption, right? Because like again, we're continuously kind of hitting the topics we started with, right? Which is humans are humans, right? And if you start making stuff harder for humans, they're not going to do it. But if you can line up where the most secure is also the easiest thing, that's when you start to see things really really take off and everything kind of gets better, right? So.
Yeah. And that's an old Krebs statement, right? Krebs always said, make it easier for users to do the right thing and harder for them to do the wrong. And I think you've pretty well just summated that as well. So.
Anything you'd like to add?
No, that was all very well said.
All right, fantastic.
Get one a
Well,
day,
kind of
Vin.
moving
We get one a
on
day.
from that one. Thinking about risk, it should come as no surprise that our next big risk of 2023 here is not having cyber insurance for your customers. With the greater scope of the government looking down at MSPs, more regulations looming, people are realizing, man, there's a lot of risk here, and you've got to protect yourself against that. And it's hard. So, Andy, I'd love to hear, your thoughts on this one, how you can make it easier, the importance of it, anything around like those people who may be struggling. Is this really worth it? How much work am I going to have to do? How can I even approach this if it's a new and scary thing for me?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, we're in these conversations every day. Like a core of our business is working with MSPs to help their clients get cyber insurance and to really kind of translate across those two worlds, right? The world of sort of cybersecurity and technology and the world of insurance, which in many cases are sort of running in parallel, trying to kind of address this issue of cyber risk, but not really speaking the same language. And so we try and sort of bridge that gap. I think it's sort of a must-have for almost every business, right? It's kind of when you actually look at what these incidents cost and what the experience is like, it's often hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, right? Which will end a small business, right? And it's honestly almost always a rounding error in terms of its cost. I mean, we regularly hear the question when we start presenting pricing of like, is that a monthly price? Because they see the price and they can't kind of believe that it's that cheap, right? And again, it fits in that sort of like independent and redundant system. Insurance is a highly independent safety system. It's a financial instrument protecting technological stuff. And I think the more you know about technology and the more you understand about cybersecurity, the more you realize how vulnerable things are, right? It's sort of like I talked with a bunch of people who were like doing election security stuff, and like you bring up the idea of like voting over the internet, and they're like, oh my God, that's a terrible idea. Like if you get on an airplane and you like talk to the pilot and you're like, should I fly or should I drive? And they're like, flying's like the safest way that you could ever do it. Like the more you know, the more you like feel comfortable about like airline travel. The more you know, the less you feel comfortable around the security of technology. You're just like, it's scary out here. And so the fact that people are driving around on the internet without insurance, I mean, you wouldn't do that if your whole family was in the car and you're like, oh yeah. And there's like, random criminals who are like going to try and bang into me and like knock me off the road and then hold me up for ransom, right? Like that's like, wait, I can buy insurance for that thing? Yeah, where do I sign up?
I'd take a slightly different approach to this whole risk conversation and cyber insurance is that, energy cannot be created or destroyed. There's this theory of relativity, right, to some extent. I'd make a same hyperbole statement that risk cannot be created or destroyed. You can simply take on more of it by certain actions. You can decide to take other actions to mitigate some of it. You can take actions to just accept some of it. But at the end of the day, you also can transfer some of it, and you can have conversations with people of, this is a risk bet I'm willing to make. Here's the posture I'm in. Would you like to share in my risk for a potential profit of this many premium return dollars if it doesn't manifest? And so you get into this concept of no cyber insurance. Cyber insurance is a normalizing force that you will still see more and more of. There's fire insurance, yet we don't burn down buildings often. There are all of those things. So not having cyber insurance does make the risk larger in the sense that you don't have the technical capabilities oftentimes, or the funds to get through and solve this for real. And so I would just second everything he said, but just remember, risk is an object that has to be discussed in how you're going to deal with it, not getting rid of it. It doesn't ever go away. You can't destroy it. If you're in business and you make money, someone's always wanting to steal that money. It's just the way it works. This has been a yin and yang of the world forever, as far as it goes back. So risk is one of those things where taking a pragmatic approach to it and ensuring the rest is probably my best advice to most companies.
And nice too, right? To be able to say, okay, we have risks that we can't mitigate necessarily, but at least we can mitigate the effects of it, right? And
Correct.
go after a different dimension there.
Recovery. Mhm. That's
Ben, any
exactly-
thoughts here?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's chapter one around like of security is making sure that you understand how to calculate risk, do your business impact assessment, and then weigh what things you cannot or will not do.
Yeah.
And then have and allow cyber insurance to cover it. But yeah, at the end of the day, get cyber insurance. I mean, it's the more you know about what's going on out there and the amount of risks that you are exposed to, purely because of the amount of surface area that you're dealing with when you operate as on the internet, not online, everywhere else. It's something that you definitely need to ensure that you have, but going to the board and asking for the right amount, understanding your overall risk landscape, you got to do the homework. You got to figure out like, okay, what is that risk and how many dollars am I putting on the line here? But then, so with that, I mean, it's funny how, Andy, you brought up the airline industry, which is like, it started out like back 100 years ago, like one out of every 315,000, passengers, there was a death, but now it's 1 to 8 million, right? So it's just like, they brought it down, that whole risk, then they brought their insurance policies down, I hope, as well, because they had a concerted effort to improve technology and automation and using that data so that they can improve the safety of flying, right? So that it's so much more safer than driving. We got 1 million people out there like in their own cars, instead of like saying, okay, yeah, this is the best way to do it because we have leaned in on informing everyone about how it should be done as an industry. And I think MSPs and IT will get there too. We're just it's kind of in its early days.
Yeah,
Well,
and
so-
I'll just finish, if Matt, if it's okay if I finish that. I think you
Please.
agree with both of you, right? I think in general, we're very early days in the sort of cybersecurity and cyber risk game, right? And if you look, and I think insurance helps us understand sort of some of the time scale of some of these other areas where we have significantly reduced the risk, right? And it's measured in decades, whether that's in airlines or in fire or in auto, right? And the sort of opportunity of technology and insurance working together to particularly, and insurance is particularly good, not just of providing the protection, but actually quantifying
Actuarial data. Yeah, exactly. That's y'all's jam.
and that's what we're doing. I mean, we're owned by a major reinsurer. And so we have data, we believe, on the vast majority of all cyber incidents that have been made, that there's been an insurance claim been made over the last 5 years. And even kind of like, large cybersecurity organizations don't have anywhere near the sort of breadth and detail of data there, partly because, the secret confidential nature of stuff. And so, working together, sharing that data, sharing those learnings, kind of helping improve everything and making it sort of simple for the end customer that they can go, hey, technology and insurance are going to kind of together work out what are the requirements here. I basically just need to write the checks and meet those requirements. And then I can go back to like focusing on whatever my normal job is, and let the the cyber risk nerds worry about all the details, right?
Yeah.
I like to finish this off. I guess one of the benefits of being the host is that you get to just make those global decisions. To get back to the flight analogy, one of the things that's really interesting, right, about reducing the risk of flights, reducing the number of deaths, is you can say, okay, we're going to really re-engineer that airplane wing because we want it to be more efficient, be able to flex a certain amount because that's actually better than having a rigid wing. But what doesn't happen when you're in the air is you don't have somebody who goes in and says, oh, that's interesting. Your airplane wing is relying on the Bernoulli principle to create a vacuum and lift it into space. If I change the viscosity of the air and then I introduce a current right here, I can drop this plane out of the sky right now. What happens if I do that from 70 million miles away behind, 3 different VPNs and anonymizing services? But the reality is, in technology, we are working with people who are like altering the fabric of reality. And we are figuring out how to protect against that because we haven't had to do that when we've dealt with the physical reality
doesn't change much.
So,
Yeah.
So I mean, in the meantime, while we're still figuring out how do we stop someone from like changing our air to jelly, getting insurance is a good idea.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and
so
you hit on another part of that corollary though from the airline industry from that earlier, Vin's example there of at the same time, the airline pilots had to be regulated. They could only do the certain things. They could only take off the same way. They could only be regulated by ATC with a certain handoff. And ATSB had the ability to do this and every place. And we had, you don't see that on the cars. You have every idiot like me driving. And it's even more reason to bring it back to less humans, more automation, more technology, more scripting. Anyways.
And it's checklists too. The checklists will just truly never go away. I mean,
and they would have a checklist for the jelly situation vis-a-vis Bernoulli's principle falling apart, right? And you would go to that section. So I guess moving on here, kind of getting around to, again, the outcome of the risks. Like we've been talking about all these things you can do to prevent it, the basics, some of the more advanced attacks, the protections you have, and ultimately it all comes down, I think, right now, at least very largely to ransomware. Number 9 on our list here is ransomware. It's still out there and it is still a nightmare. You might have a discussion about, oh, ransomware is up this quarter, ransomware is down globally this quarter, but reality, it's still a huge part of the risk landscape in cybersecurity. And I'd love to hear some thoughts around keeping that on your radar and how you use that in conversations and keeping that as kind of the big boogeyman right now. I can always go first, but Andy, if you wanted to go before me, I'd be glad to wait.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously some really interesting trends over the last couple of years, right? Obviously, ransomware has been increasing, although you saw a little bit of a decline, at least in the last year.
In the Coveware report, yeah.
Right. And that's, I think a couple of things. I think, the Ukrainian war, both the Ukrainians and the Russians were pretty active in the ransomware market on the criminal side, right? And so they've been pretty busy with each other. So I think we're seeing some of the benefits there. I think there's also been some greater appreciation for some of the particularly backup as well as multi-factor authentication for making it a little bit more challenging for organizations to get control of full operations, right? And also particularly some of the organizations that didn't think that they were potentially impacted by cyber attacks, manufacturing facilities, schools, et cetera, where they now are much more aware of the threat. So I think again, I don't think it's going to go away, but I think we may be, there will be ebbs and flows, and I think we're kind of in an ebb period, at least momentarily.
Yeah, I would add to that, Andy, real quick, in the sense that I think ransomware is changing. We are seeing people with defenses, so you have less outcome from ransomware. We've seen that in the recent couple of Coveware reports, right? But I think the point is that ransomware is changing too. And business email compromise is also a much faster path to monetization still. So you see both of those coming together. But with ransomware, one of my good friends at CISA is afraid that the next pivot is moving towards OT, in the sense that I could still ransom you by locking you out of your building, by turning your HVAC to 300 degrees, by not letting you out of your building after doing said, right? And so you see this world where you've seen a revision of SP 853 or 83, sorry, around OT and how OT is now defined as anything that kind of moves anything in the world. And so ransomware won't go away, to Andy's point. It'll shift, it'll pivot, it'll become something else, but they're still going to extract money by making your vulnerable systems be used against you and extracting the ability to use your systems. So I agree with Andy on that.
Been anything over on your end?
Not much to add. It's going to continue. I mean, like I said, it's extortion. It's there's money to be made. And it's as long as you have something valuable, someone's going to go after it and try to monetize it. So yeah, I think my biggest concern right now is just related to MSPs is they're in the supply chain, right? They
force multiplier.
They are the target. Now
Yeah.
the MSPs being the target is what we're thinking through, and how do they protect themselves so that they can protect their end customers. It's going to continue to proliferate.
Mm-hmm. In terms of all the things that lead to ransomware, having your data everywhere, we're going to wrap it up quickly with a kick over to Andy, because I know you have a hard stop coming up. Number 10 is ShadowIT, lacking your control where your data is scattered. How's that on your radar in terms of cyber risks?
Yeah, I mean, again, like from a ransomware perspective, right? Like you are seeing sort of like triple extortion, right? So, obviously locking up and losing access to your stuff was kind of what most commonly seen, but then, exfiltrating and threatening to give it away would be kind of like number 2, and number 3 would be kind of like then maybe contacting your customers, suppliers, et cetera, and letting them know that
Triple extortion
organization has it, right? And so one of the challenges with ShadowIT is like, particularly the egress of data becomes a lot easier, right? Because again, there's stuff that's connected in here, right? Yep. And so again, that attack surface is growing, hard to understand, right? But I think organizations, people spin up ShadowIT because they can't do stuff that they want to do, right? And so if you make it so hard, if you got so much security controls, the approval process is months long, you're going to be in organizations that's constantly going to be battling it, right? So you got to think through, the balance of like availability of new stuff.
At your vendors.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a struggle. I struggle whether or not the word ShadowIT, that is IT. So
Yeah.
it is these days. It is how work is done, and the question is whether or not, like with CIS 2.1, it's kind of like inventory your software, and then making sure that you authorize certain ones, but that there is the ability to have unauthorized software and unsupported. But how do you track all of that?
Yeah.
It like Andy said, I mean, folks are going to find a way to get their work done. Somehow that PDF file is going to be sent to a Dropbox somewhere, and you don't know about it. I mean, but at least you can put some controls in place to be aware of those things. But yeah, I mean, it goes back to having some level of automated inventory, having the ability to share and be aware of that data. Or the software that's running within your environment. That's pretty much all you can do, because it'll find a way. Matt?
Yeah. No, I would hit this on the head. You start thinking about this. A lot of ShadowIT problems are definitely what Andy and Vin have mentioned. They're the lack of ability to solve a business goal, because your users just want to win in business. That's it. But at the same time, you maybe one day send a developer home, and they're using their home machine, and you haven't taken away local admin access, and you don't know what they're using. And ShadowIT can also be, let's say, that same Plex server that's running in that environment that I get in through because it's not updated. Why? Because you were allowing new protect surface without having any concept of its attack surface, because you're not even aware of the software. Well, how do you solve that? You take away local admin rights. You set up functions so that your system doesn't allow someone to sign in from a bring your own device. You set it up so that the sensitive data that might matter the most is even more protected from that. And the data that needs to be used every day might work somewhere else. But you would basically make this to where you're aware of it. To Vin's point, you can track it through things like Liongard with their endpoint agent, or through cloud app access, through those type of things of DNS filtering and things like that, and start saying, I'm going to be aware of where that surface is. And then I'm going to start making retroactive decisions, hopefully left of boom, to Vin's earlier point, that say, nah, we're going to block off Dropbox. I'm going to take care of it. Like when I was at my MSP, I went and registered a Dropbox enterprise account of one license just so I could set up SSO and block off anybody else with that same email address. No, right? They're going to go use their home email address. They're going to do other things, but it's a bit of a cat and mouse game of ensuring that your people have what they need to do their jobs and to win the mission for the business, but also stopping their ability to do the wrong thing. It goes back to Krebs saying we should take away people's ability to make the wrong decisions as much as possible. And that's clearly not done in a lot of the breaches and the very public ones you've seen recently. That was tied to the inability to say as an executive leadership team, no, we're not giving people access to stuff from their house. They're going to have to use a SAW, secure administrative workstation, or they're going to have to use SDP or ZTNA or other things. So I'll say a billion words, but ShadowIT is probably one of the biggest untalked about surface areas. Control 2.1, what software am I using, is probably the least represented. If I looked at somebody's approach to CIS 2.1, I've probably never seen more than an 80% solution ever. They write the control off, but they're probably only talking about 80% of the actual software volume that's out there. So, Vin, that'd be my thoughts on it, man. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, we have blazed through these here. I want to thank both of you. We had to lose Andy here. That you had a hard stop and jumped. But thank you both for all of your time and for your answers. It's been an awesome conversation. I know I've learned a lot. And I wanted to open up the floor quickly for each of you to give any closing thoughts, anything that's on your mind that we haven't talked about quickly, or just things that you think people should know before they go. Matt, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I talked this year that this is the year we're actually at some level of density for success. Right? Vin, you started this company years and years ago as a security company. The appetite wasn't there. The understanding wasn't there. The maturity wasn't there. The demand wasn't there. The drive wasn't there. The market forces weren't there, but they are now very deeply here. And I think if I was giving any advice to an MSP out there around the security threats, or a business out there around these security threats, this is the year you actually are equipped to win. The tools are out there. The relationships are out there. The data is out there. The only thing it's not, and the only difference factor is whether or not you're going to go learn it, whether you're going to implement it, and whether you're going to commit to that constant march of what this takes to actually secure something, and then whether or not you're going to monetize that correctly with your customers. And so I would just say that right now, this is the year to win in getting more of a holistic cybersecurity practice where you admit to the failures and the gaps and the risks and things you can't solve, you insure them away, and you just help people go make money and drive their business to success. I'm a big bullish on 2023 for us making high margins and driving that forward. So.
Yeah, that's super optimistic. I think yeah, that the ecosystem is working together. The ecosystem starting to share. We're discussing it more. There is no excuse at this point. It's documented. You've got your CIS controls. You have your NIST. You have the most recent. What is it? We call it StratENATI, right? The Strategic National.
Yes, thank you. You've listened to my show.
The guidance, like this is what we're gonna. Yeah. So it's we are committed, and the resources are being put in place in order to speak and act on security. And I think Liongard is part of that, to provide that data, to provide the conduit to provide MSPs that visibility into the configuration management controls and process that they need to have. But it's only part of it. It's only a very small part of it. And then the rest of it has to do with process and teaching and making folks aware and using, there's people, but there's one saying from a CISO I met, which is like, your people are probably your best alarms as well. And train them and to recognize those things. It's better than the system happening, and alerting you. So they can take actions prior to any system going off. And that's kind of what I'm trying to think through is like security is not just about securing, but it's about safety. And if we all align behind safe computing practices and making sure that we do things to protect the company and the business and your data, that's about safety and making sure that you can continue to do business and do it well.
I always love wrapping on this note, because for me, this is the core of humanity, right? You can have, the more that you have the technical tools, the more you have the high caliber automation software, the more the people matter, because the more that they can do, the more that they are freed up to do the things that only a human mind can do, that only we can do with our communication skills. Also, the more that we rely on these technical schools, the more that a single human can completely compromise and bypass all of them in some ways, because they can just, give up their credentials and then get through, or they can, somehow walk through a door and then just like give something over, decide, this isn't really worth it. I'm like, screw these guys, I'm going to go do something else. And they can leave your organization. How much redundancy do you have built in for institutional knowledge when things go? And just being able to support your people, being able to be kind to them will definitely lead to good security outcomes. So 2023, the year of people, good architecture, automation, and getting the basics right.
Oh, cheers to that.
All right. Well, fantastic conversation. Thank you both for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thanks, Matt.
Good seeing you. Good seeing you, Matt. Doctor. See y'all.